Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be both a prequel of a previous lesson and also an expansion. The lesson we already covered, we did Acts 9:10 to the whole way through, and what we read of that is sort of Paul's calling, but there's really two visions in the 9th chapter of the book of Acts. The one is Paul, or Saul as he was then known. Well, that's the range we're going to be discussing today. Then we read of where Ananias, a disciple in Damascus, where Paul was en route to persecuting before he had been converted. He was on his way to arrest Christians, and who should arrest him but the master? But much of what we read after this is really Paul's calling through that vision. Much of what he's told to Ananias is going to repeat, because we're also going to take this in the 22nd and the 26th chapter, where we read of Luke's recording of Paul's personal description of these events. So it all begins in, we first meet Saul in the towards the tail end of the 7th chapter in the 58th verse, and threw him out of the city and stoned him. And the witness laid down their garments at the feet of a young man named Paul. And so Paul was there. He was consenting. He was, we're going to learn about him, but he was an aspiring rabbi on the rise, and also he really had a zeal for persecuting these people, and so much so that it had the inadvertent effect of spreading the mission, because persecution has a scattering effect. It blows the seed to the wind, because when you're persecuted in one place, what are you going to do? You're going to take the message to another place. And Paul, of course, more than anyone else, brought this message to the ends of the earth. And the opening verse of the 8th chapter read, "And Saul was giving approval to his death. And when on that day there was a great persecution against the assembly, which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the countries of Judah and Samaria, except the apostles." So Paul authorized and approved the death. It was given at his permission, essentially, shall we say. And the great persecution erupted after Stephen's martyrdom. They were locking them up, if not killing them just yet. But a lot of them fled and got away to Judah and Samaria. And this is actually the next stage of the Great Commission, because what do we read in Acts 1:8? The concentric circles begins in Jerusalem. That's what we read of in the first 7 chapters. Then Judah and Samaria. Samaria is where the good news spreads in the 8th verse. And then the 9th is kind of to the ends of the earth, because it begins with Paul, who was the appointed evangelist to the Gentiles. But except the apostles, so that means they stayed behind. They had work to do in Jerusalem, but Paul may have thought that they had scattered to Damascus, that which he was en route to do. And then we're just going to open with the opening verse of the 9th chapter. "But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the master, having come to the high priest." So Paul was murderously motivated. These aren't just threats, they are murders. So he wants to kill them. He wants to physically get rid of them, take away their lives. And that is what his verbs suggest, or at least his language. And he sought and sealed the approval and the authority of the high priest to stamp out the scattering church, because he knew that it had scattered to the wind. So he was determined to stamp it out, to make sure the seed of this heresy could grow no more. And of course, the outstanding irony is he, more than anyone else, was spread the seed the furthest. "Ask them from letters to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any who were in the way, whether men or women, to bring them bound to Jerusalem." Damascus was the capital city of the neighboring nation of Syria to the north. There were some 70 or 80 Jewish synagogues in this city, and the earliest Christians congregated at the synagogues because they were Jews. And the name of the way is just the name of Christianity. It's personified in Yahshua, who is the way, the truth, and the life. So that's also a designation. We only read the word Christian 3 times in the New Testament. Disciple appears 263 times. And the way is an alternative name for Christian. So before Christianity called itself that, and we read that there was at Antioch, the same city in Syria, it was a bigger city, but that's where they first came to be called Christians, and henceforth that assembly would replace Jerusalem as the nucleus of the new faith, and it's also the city from which Paul launched his missionary journeys. There's 3 of them in the book of Acts. And it came to be that as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light flashed around him from the heavens. So from the heavens, that's a pretty fair indicator that it is from divinity. And he was en route to Damascus, and he was just suddenly, this event could have only transpired in the twinkling of an eye. He was en route, walking, everything was well. Then suddenly a light flashes all around him from the heavens, and that this light is no ordinary light. It actually physically blinds him till the healing touches of Ananias, who is also given another vision to tell him what to do, to Paul, who is similarly communicated to meet this man in Damascus. We'll read what his instructions are. And he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? So Paul is not instantly aware of who that voice is. He knows that he's dealing with a force stronger than himself because he falls to the ground and he hears a voice, and the voice is telling him, why do you persecute me? Who was the only people he was persecuting? Christians. He thought he was persecuting followers of the way. Little did he know that he was persecuting the master himself, who enters into the pains and the struggles of all of his children, those who are willing to endure the persecution for his sake. Our suffering from him it's not extra credit, it's the mandatory minimum obligation for one who suffered so willingly for us. And so a pretty fair indicator is how we treat the least among his children. That's paradoxically a reflection of how we treat him, who is the greatest among the followers of the way. He's the one who paved the way, he's the one who points the path, and he's the one who leads us all the way home to heaven. And he said, Who are you, Master? And the Master said, I am Joshua, whom you persecute. It is hard for you to kick against the prods. So, in response to his question, who are you, he doesn't know who his identity was. He knows he's dealing with something greater than himself. But as far as he knew, there was only Satan and Yahweh, but he's dealing with a physical encounter of the resurrected Savior, the one whose resurrection and claims to messiahship he had denied. Here he has a full frontal witness in view, undeniable, irrefutable evidence that the Master was resurrected because he was appearing to him in such form, and he was telling him that he was persecuting me. So he takes personally how we treat his children, and we Christians are not immune to abusing the children, so how we treat the least among us is a fair indicator of how we treat him. But it is hard for you to kick against the prods, alternately translated as goads. This describes the conversion experience as an irresistible force. So Paul, even though he was committed to the heart, there was nothing that could have stopped him from stamping out the Christians all the way to the end of the earth, but a direct visible intervention from the one who was stamping out, who reoriented his energies. He had a lot of admirable characteristics. He was persistent and diligent and motivated and passionate and zealous, even before he became a Christian. So what the Master did was transform his resourcefulness to his cause, because he reoriented henceforth, now and forever, the destructive energies into a more constructive kingdom, the most constructive cause of all, which is the spread and growth of the kingdom. Both trembling and being astonished, he said, Master, what do you want me to do? And the Master to him, Arise and go into the city, and you shall be told what you have to do. So he's afraid. He knows he's up against something greater than himself, and it is the one he had denied his resurrection. Here enough, he had a clear enough indicator that he was who he says he was. He was divine. He was the Son of Yahweh. He was before his face at this moment in time, so he could draw no other possible conclusion than that one. And what does he do? The conversation between him and the superior force is brief but thorough, so he's told that this is the first stage of the next stage, which is going to be, he's going to be blinded, but he's going to have to rise through the assistance of his companions, who we read of in the next verse, where they were going to escort this blind man to the city where he would receive his sight. from one by Ananias, but that is all he has and all he knows of the master at this point. And the physical blindness which he induces is typologically significant for Paul. It is a revelation of his own spiritual blindness. So having gained this sight back, he had a new vision and a new outlook on life and a new mission and purpose that came because his eyes had been opened from the blindness he was living in when he was persecuting him up until 3 days ago. And the men journeying with him stood speechless, hearing indeed the voice, but seeing no one. So as the creator and controller of physical matter, Yahshua is not subjected to its elements. He is capable of existing inside them and outside them. He can control what we see of others and only those who hear. So the message would have been clear. They had a verbal element. He would have stimulated the sight of sound in the organ of ear with his presence. And but they didn't see anyone, so they were not blinded by the occasion. They did not see what Paul had seen. This was not a vision for them. It was some form of a revelation. They had access to a divine voice, but they were not as committed to spirituality as was Paul. So Paul didn't ask for this revelation. He wasn't expecting it. He walked into it, and I think the initiative in 10 out of 10 theophanic manifestations lies on divinity. I'd be very surprised if a human ever prayed for his manifestation and it came, although that's not, something I want to discourage you from doing. I just personally don't see fit to, because believing isn't seeing. Seeing isn't believing. Believing is seeing. So I don't need to see him. I think, my faith is strong enough that he is. I can feel him. I can hear his voice. I have a relationship with him. So he's something very, very real to me. And I do not need to see him this side of the resurrection to have my faith intact this side of the resurrection. And Saul arose from the ground, but when his eyes were opened, he saw no one. And leading him by the hand, they brought him to Damascus. So he was blind for the moment, for the purpose, and the purpose for which he was blinded was, as we earlier alluded to give him a typological revelation of his own spiritual blindness. So Paul thought he was doing the right thing. We read of in John 16:2 that those will persecute you in the synagogue, and they will think they were doing it in the service of Elohim. That is what Paul was en route to do. Remember, there were 70, 80 synagogues in the city of Damascus, and we can infer that Paul was determined to just go in and tear it all up, tear it all down, hunt down these heretics. But here he finds himself helpless and at the mercy of his companions who were sent by the high priest to escort him to this land. And that's what they do, but he's blind, so he can't see anything at all, but he did see the Savior before he lost his sight, and lost his sight as a direct result of it. It's not by accident that Yahweh told Moses that no man can behold my presence, so his supernal light is beyond our fleshly eyes' capacity to withstand or endure. And he was 3 days without sight, and did not eat nor drink. So this probationary period of physical blindness was lasted for 3 days, and this can be likened to his resurrection, because he saw the resurrection and he spent 3 days in the grave of blindness after having seen the resurrection, and he becomes a partaker in the resurrection. He's baptized immediately upon receiving his restored sight, and he goes into the city of Damascus, preaches boldly at the synagogue there, and so he wastes no time at all making the most of his calling and his purpose. And without the physical sight, he couldn't have had the spiritual sight, because he couldn't have traveled as far as he did but he was not eating or drinking, so he was in a state of dejectedness, and he was not in a healthy state, but he had just been blinded, but he would be restored and reoriented towards a more constructive cause. So several chapters later, in the 22nd verse, we read of Paul's personal description, and this is to a Jewish assembly. And what we witness in both the 22nd and the 26th chapter is Paul working the audience. He's a master orator, and a master orator takes stock of who he's addressing, so the audience is going to determine what needs to be said and what he's going to say. So it's really quite artful how he addresses this, but we're only going to cover the verses of the vision itself, and the material of which overlaps with what we covered in Acts 9. I am indeed Jewish, having been born in Tarsus of Cilicia, and brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, having been instructed according to the exactness of the law of our fathers, being ardent for Elohim, as you are all today, who persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering up into prisons both men and women, as also the high priest bears me witness, and all the eldership, from whom I also received letters to the brothers, and went to Damascus for bringing in chains even those who were there to Jerusalem to be punished. That's 3 verses, but a single sentence. So he reminds him of his pedigree. He's a Jew. He's a Pharisee of a Pharisee, groomed by the instruction of Gamaliel. He was a respected member of the Sanhedrin who actually spared the early Christian experiment from extinction with his wise, prudent intervention, of which we read of in the 5th chapter of Acts. And he was reared and educated and conditioned for the law. He was a rabbi, so that would have been his purpose, to teach the law. And he had a zeal and a passion, the same zeal and passion. So he recognized that what was compelling them to have him explain himself or answer charges was the same thing that was once in him. Because he persecuted the way all the way to death. Remember, he breathed out threats and murder against them, so he was not playing games or kidding with these people's lives. And he didn't care if they were men or women. They were all worthy of being bound in prison, if not dead, for that. And he had the full authority. He had friends in positions and high influence, so he had a connection, a personal, professional connection to the high priest. He was his lieutenant to stamp out this new heresy. He had volunteered for the assignment. He had presented his plan to the high priest, who approved and sealed and authorized him. And he went to Damascus to bring in chains, that means in prison, take them back to Jerusalem to stand trial and be punished before the Sanhedrin. So he was going to go at the Sanhedrin's behest to bring them back to their presence and judgment, these heretics and blasphemers, as the Jews saw them. And it came to be, as I was journeying and coming near Damascus about noon, suddenly a great light shone around me out of the heavens, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? So there's a little more detail here from Paul's vantage point, at least, than Luke's personal recitation of the event. And Luke was intimate companions with Paul, so he definitely received this story from him. But so he was en route. He was near Damascus at noon. These are 2 details we don't read. We read the time of the day and also the proximity to the destination. So he was almost there. He was ready to go and bound these Christians up and torture them and flail them and just discard them ultimately. But suddenly a great light shone around me. That was the the luminosity of his presence is something physically blinding for the eyes of flesh to behold. And he instantly submitted. He fell to the ground. He was in the presence of a superior power than him. And the voice told him the same thing we read of in Acts 9, why do you persecute me? He takes it personally, what Paul was doing to his people. He was in fact doing to him. That is something Paul never paused to consider. And he wouldn't have even considered it if he knew that he was who these people said he was. So he had no earthly interaction with the Messiah, and that is why he says in passages such as 1 Corinthians 2:1, I preach the Messiah, him crucified and alone. So he had his only knowledge and revelation of the Savior was in resurrected form, so he tends to emphasize that in all of his writings. And I answered, Who are you, master? And he said to me, I am Joshua of Nazareth, whom you persecute. So he told him who he was and what he was doing to him. He was the superior power who was overwhelming him and surrounding him and just subsuming him. And he told him that he persecuted him, so he had enough. Paul was inflicting a lot of pain on his people, and he had to intervene on their behalfs to reorient this man's energy in their cause because his actions, efforts, abilities, and energies were misguided. So he just needed a little nudge on the other side of the road, and the only one who could have nudged him at this present moment in time, because he's all these things, he's determined, passionate, and zealot to persecute the Christian, was a direct, visible intervention from the man himself. And those who were with me indeed saw the light and were afraid, but they did not hear the voice speaking to me. We already covered and commented on that. I'm actually trying to make enough way for time at this point. And I said, What shall I do, master? And the master said to me, Rise up, go into Damascus, and there you shall be told all that you have been appointed to do. So the only word difference we read in here is appointed. We don't remember that word from our reading of Acts 9. So everything that was this very moment had been appointed providentially, and he had an appointment that he was going to fulfill and learn about, and it was to Ananias that he was told he would be the apostle to the Gentiles. And as I could not see because of the esteem of that light, being led by the hand of those who were with me, I came into Damascus. So he's at the mercy of the traveling companions who were there with him. That's something we already covered. Now we just want to make our way over to the 26th chapter, beginning in the 8th verse. So it's a different setting and different audience. Remember, I wanted to get you to appreciate the personal dynamics and elements that Paul was working with and around when he gave his personal recollected description of this experience. So here he's before Agrippa, and he would have been the Jewish authority, the son of one of the Herods, and he would have been aligned with the Sadducees. They generally had the pull at the temple level. But, there are Pharisees in the audience, and he identifies himself as a Pharisee. And so he's really talking to them when we read what we read. But in the 19th verse, the one we're going to close with, we read him returning to King Agrippa. So he knows who he's talking to and who he's addressing. So in the 8th verse, he says, Why is it considered unbelievable among you if Elohim raises the dead? So the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they differed on this doctrine. The Sadducees denied it. The Pharisees affirmed it. The Sadducees only they only affirmed the canonicity of the writings of Moses, whereas the Pharisees had the fuller access to the revelation of the writings and prophets, which established the cardinal tenet of Orthodox Judaism. It is the belief or the concept is nothing new to us. We inherited it from them, but we understand it as a personification and a historical fact, whereas they tend to think of it as something yet to be fulfilled. Therefore, indeed, I thought within myself that I ought to do much against the name of Joshua of Nazareth. Now, what's interesting here is he says, I thought to within myself. So he had not consulted Yahweh. He was so wrapped up in the minutia of the law he was studying that he didn't take time to consult Yahweh to see if it was in fact his will to stamp out these people who were violating his interpretation of the law. He did not seek out the answer from Yahweh, so he sends his son Joshua to intervene and tell him what's up. Which also I did in Jerusalem, and I shut up many of the saints in prison, having received authority from the high priest. And when they were put to death, I gave my vote against them. Paul wouldn't have been a member of the Sanhedrin at this point, but he would have been delegated some authority by them to have a say in the matter. So he received his authority from the high priest himself. This was an individual. Caiaphas, the one who had murdered the Messiah, was the reigning high priest. But at this time, this is 20 years later, and Caiaphas is dead, and Ananias is the high priest now. And punishing them often in all synagogues, I compelled them to blaspheme, and being exceedingly enraged against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. So he describes in very gripping terms what he thought and what he did. So what he did was he went into the synagogues, round them up, punished them, dragged them to higher the ruling authorities, and he told them to blaspheme. Now, he thought they were blasphemers, but he kind of forced them to blaspheme against the one who they called the Son of Yahweh. And it was all passionately, murderously motivated, and so much so that his tentacles spread to foreign cities. While thus engaged as I was journeying to Damascus with authority and commission from the high priest, at midday, O king, I saw a light from the heavens, brighter than the sun, shining around me and those who journeyed with me. So he's actually addressing King Agrippa at this point, at this juncture. So he addresses him about his title, king, and he reminds him much of what we already read. There was a blinding light that was brighter than the sun. That's a detail that's new to us, so we understand the light. There's nothing brighter than the sun, and if we look at it for even 20 seconds directly, that can have devastating ripple effects on our permanent eye vision. So that we understand why this blinded him, because it was brighter than the sun, and it was shining all around him. And also those journeying with me. Now we read in an earlier account, in the Acts 9 account, that those who heard did not see. So that's a curious discrepancy. We honestly didn't notice it till now, and we don't really know what to say, but this does not diminish our faith and our endorsement of the inerrancy of Scripture. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice speaking to me and saying in the Hebrew language, Paul, Paul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the prods. So the detail we read here is that he spoke to him in the Hebrew language. This would have been the native language, although not the colloquial or common language. Aramaic was in currency. That would have been the language that was spoken on the street. That would have been the casual conversation. But Greek would have also been the writing of the New Testament. And there was also Latin, which Paul was trilingual. He was fluent in Aramaic, Hebrew, and he was a Roman citizen, so he would have known Latin. But he was addressed in the native tongue, the proper tongue. The sacred name aligns with the Hebrew language, and that's why we preserve it and guard it. And I said, Who are you, Master? And he said, I am Yahshua, whom you persecute. So nothing new to read here or comment on. But rise up and stand on your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you a servant and a witness, both of what you saw and of those which I shall reveal to you. So this is an important detail. So he appeared to him for this purpose. We read of the purpose in the 22nd chapter, but the purpose for his appearance is to communicate and instill in him the purpose, which is his mission and destiny. And so he's not. This isn't to be the closing of a chapter, but the opening of a book. He's to tell people what he has seen and what he has heard. This is going to be foundation to his evangelical outburst and momentum. So he's also promised more revelation. So he hasn't seen the fullness yet. His relationship is not ended. He will receive more revelation from this point, which he describes several of in the gap between the 9th and the 26th chapter. Delivering you from peoples and the Gentiles, to whom I now send you, to open their eyes, to turn them from darkness to light, and the authority of Satan to Elohim, in order for them to receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who are sanctified by faith in me. So Paul had been blinded on the road, and he had been restored to sight. This was his debt to open those who were in a similar state of spiritual blindness. He now seeing what he saw, he had to tell what he saw and open the eyes of others. And this was a battle, a cosmic struggle between good and evil, personified respectively by Elohim and Satan. So even the chosen people, the Jews, Paul was aligned with Satan, and much of the Sanhedrin were at this time. Gamaliel was the exception, and Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. There were good people in the Pharisees and Sanhedrin, but just to return to the passage, the forgiveness of sins and inheritance, that inheritance is eternal, and it is made possible by the forgiveness of sins, because if we enter into the judgment with any of our sins unconfessed or unrepented of, and we do not submit to the atonement in faith, then we will have no chance at that dreaded date. And we're just going to close with the 19th verse. Therefore, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision of the heavens. This would have been an irresistible force, and we cannot gather that having resisted, having such an extraordinary phenomenon, one could not resist the compulsion of what that vision instilled. And, there's more I'd like to say, but I'm off. I really need to cut it now. We're past the 30-minute mark. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.